So we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you very much for coming. We are going to address what does hope look like in the context of climate. And this title came out of the Copenhagen negotiations, where a youth from Toronto got up in the circumpolar talk and really challenged the entire room to define personally what does hope look like and how to get there. So hopefully this will become a dialogue beyond our thoughts. So think about that as you hear us talk. So we will start with Dr. Badrinarayana, and she teaches at Chapman, and she has been working particularly, we were in Copenhagen together, and since then she's been working specifically in the nuclear context, and we'll do a broad overview, and you've got quite a lineup in terms of folks that have been taking various different slices of the international perspective, and I'll just run down the list and then let people introduce themselves more in depth. So we've got Dr. Will Burns, who is at Johns Hopkins Climate and Energy Center and working with Ruth and others in the DC context to try and bring a more international perspective to the national discussion. And Harry Osofsky, who's at University of Minnesota and is working in just about every aspect of climate and international work that I know of. And so the energy, the sheer personal energy of the folks up here is remarkable, collective energy. And so I will leave it at that, and then, Elizabeth Burleson, I am at PACE and working on human rights and environment, climate, energy, water, and good governance issues, and have been part of the negotiations dating from pre-Rio and the drafting of the UNFCCC Agenda 21 and Rio Declaration, and was with the UNICEF delegation in Bali, and will be in Durban, and have been particularly looking at the environmentally sound technology transfer aspect of the negotiations, where there is some hope. Okay.
Thank you. Maybe I'll use the podium. Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Or is it still morning? Yes, good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. And I thank the Law Review and Professor Sharp for hosting us and organizing this wonderful conference, a timely conference. Our panel, of course, has a nice title, Hope, but I want to start with a crisis before I come to the hope and start look at what hopeless looks like. And in the previous panel, we spoke about crisis itself. Joel Chapman spoke about what do we mean by crisis. I'm not going to revisit that, but I think that's an important question, because I think in terms of international law and climate change, we're really looking at not just a crisis, but a chronic illness that has plagued international law, and that seems to be reaching the heights of a crisis at this point as we struggle to find a legal solution to this extremely complex problem. What I'm going to do today is identify 3 areas of crisis in relation to climate change and international law, and talk briefly about those crises, and then move very briefly to what I would think is hope. And I'm going to construe hope in a very ideological way, because hope is about ideology. It's not about being bound by the rules, in my view. So I'm going to finish off on that note. So starting with the 3 crises that I've identified. The three crises that I'll speak about are, 1, the normative crisis, and the normative crisis being that it's our sense of norms in international law is severed at this point quite deeply from our sense of justice and morality. And the second crisis that I will speak about is the global economy crisis, or the economic interest crisis, which is a lingering problem in international law and relations. And the third crisis I'll talk about is a legitimacy crisis, and in the context specifically of climate change and adaptation strategies that are in place at this point. And then I'll move on to the hope part. Now let me start very briefly with my view of the normative crisis. An example that I'd like to speak about in the context of normative crisis is the crisis we have with respect to small island states. And their threat, or the threat that they are facing with respect to sovereignty. We've understood sovereignty from the first years of law school as a basic tenet of international law. states have a right to run their domestic affairs exclusively without intervention from other states. A very basic tenet of international law, which holds good despite globalization. But right now, at this very moment, these states have little control over how they are going to manage their internal affairs. Because if you think of states such as Bangladesh, Maldives, or Tuvalu, very small island states with very small economies and very little political influence in the international field, their ability to stop sea level rise, their ability to build dams, their ability to do anything internally with respect to climate change is subject to global negotiations, which is subject to the will of about, let's say, I would say 5 states, but let's play it fair and say about 20 states. So the rest of the 200 states, or of the 200 states, only 20 states determine what should be the normative framework. And I think that's deeply disturbing and a big crisis that we face right now with respect to international law. And it's not just a normative crisis, but it's a normative crisis in the sense that it doesn't contain the moral authority that a norm should to be sustained. And I know we try to talk about moving away from norms to some extent in the previous panel, but I think it's an important problem that needs to be recognized when we talk about international law and its reach. The second crisis, which is the crisis of the global economy grounded in economic interest, is my take on what's happening in the context of China, India, Brazil, and South Africa, but specifically in the context of China and India. When I look at China and India right now, and I think I'm allowed to say it coming from India, I am reminded of the British Empire, and it's not a happy reminder from where I stand. And I say this because globalization and the current economic order has brought a lot of important changes to people in India. I was reminded yesterday, being in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame last evening, that there was a time when I really wanted to listen to Western music, really wanted to, Western was the broad term that we used in those days when I was a child in India, really wanted to listen to all these great musicians, but I had a small window of time. It was the radio program at noon on Sunday, 12 to 12:30, when this would be broadcast, because we just didn't have the means or media to hear these rock stars, right? So can you imagine anyone waiting when they're 13 years old on a Sunday for 12 o'clock to come and just listen to music? I mean, I can't think of my niece doing that now, similarly situated. So that might be kind of making light of the process of globalization, but it gives an illustration of how much change it's brought into a country like India. But at the same time, I still identify the current process, the economic process that has change the way India and China, for instance, play a role in the global economy as a problem in the context of climate change, because of the fact that they are now focused on their economic interest almost exclusively. And so much exclusively that I do not believe, for instance, in the case of India, that they are even concerned about the impacts that climate change will have on the very poor communities within the country. Which brings us to a bigger problem, which is, do states, when they are pursuing their economic interest in a global context, take into account all the interests of their citizens, of their people within? And if we compare this to the British Empire, we probably will see some kind of similarities. When the British Empire governed, one view is they had the whole world at their feet. But the other view is there were factories in England that closed down. There were people in England who did not have jobs. And there were people in England who felt left out from the process of this globalization or the exteriors of globalization. But why is this a crisis for climate change? It's a crisis for climate change because the evolution of this kind of new power dynamics based on economic pursuance of economic interest has led to a situation where we have new actors who are not interested in what I mentioned is the normative or the overall rights that might get affected because of climate change, but are almost exclusively interested in development and growth. And I think this is a problem because they are becoming more influential, and their view of international law stems from this economic interest and does not stem from a broader platform which is necessary to make sure that we have balanced approaches and can address important problems like climate change. And the third crisis I'll talk about is the legitimacy crisis. I have about 5 minutes, so there might be a point when I'll start speaking really fast, as I usually do when I speak an Indian language. But the legitimacy crisis, there are many legitimacy crises, but the one I'll talk about is with respect to adaptation. We've by now reached a point where I think nations understand that with respect to climate change, the possibility of mitigating climate change or lowering our emissions might be past. Maybe we can still make efforts, but the reality probably is that we will not be able to reverse the current trend of increase in emissions. So the next strategy, of course, is to help people adapt. And by adaptation, we mean giving people money to make sure they can build dams, they can have infrastructure in place so that they can cope with the effects of climate change. Fine idea. And nations have actually pledged about $100 billion to be split between adaptation and mitigation efforts. But there are a lot of problems when it comes to disbursing these funds. For instance, most of the multilateral development banks and also the Global Environmental Facility, which has been in charge of disbursing these funds, has imposed conditionalities on developing countries. And some conditionalities, let me give you an example of the Global Environmental Facility. One conditionality or one condition is that if you want the money, you must show that you'll put it to use in a way that it will yield global benefits and not local benefits. So let's say we have created a problem, a global problem, that was primarily for a local or national benefit of a few countries. But those who receive money cannot think of their local benefit, but must think of only the global benefit. Doesn't sound legitimate to me. I think it's a big crisis. I'm not opposed to the idea of aligning global and local benefits. I think it's important. I think it's a good strategy. But to make that a condition to receive money, that, I think, is not legitimate. And that's a legitimacy crisis, one example of a legitimacy crisis that we see in the context of climate change. There's also, ironically, another legitimacy crisis, and this may not be a direct reflection on international law, but the other legitimacy crisis is internal. Many states, many poor states, the same states which are seeking adaptation funds, are corrupt. There is a big corruption problem. In India, for the past few days, if anyone's been following the news, there was a fast undertaken by a Gandhian so that the government of India would pass a bill to address corruption. It was the first movement of the kind in India where thousands of people just gathered and showed support for this person, Anna Hazare. But it's just a sliver. It's a democratic country, and I think we've heard today, what happens in non-democratic countries. How do we legitimize certain international efforts when there is no legitimacy to those efforts? Should we be asking accountability from states within? So these are the three crises that I have identified in the context of climate change, and in the 1 minute, I'll give you my version of hope. I'm not very hopeful, frankly, and I hate to be a pessimist because I try to think that's not going to help anyone, especially as teachers. It's always hard to get into a classroom and say, you're reading all this, but right? You just don't want to say that. But I think there is hope, and the way I look at it, like I said, I'm going to define it in very idealistic terms, and the hope lies in our ability to rethink the concept of state, the role of state. How far can we vest in a state this power to represent us fairly, justly in the international setting? Can we do that? Should we start questioning our states? Not to say that the state is not important, not to say the Westphalian state or concept of state has died. State is important. But what should its role be? Should we just accept that all developing countries are poor and need to be helped and take that position, whereas it's not an accurate depiction of what's happening right now? I like to tell people, look at me, I probably pollute much more than I have to stop. But if you will give me a second to complete, so I probably pollute a lot more than some of the poorer people in the United States and richer countries. So what that means is globalization's really changed the actors in a very elementary way. And we need to recognize that. when we think about what a state, how a state should be representing its positions. And finally, I'll just finish off by saying I think we do need a new high moral ground. We need a high moral ground if we need to at least try to walk our way out of this international law crisis that we're facing in the context of climate change. Thank you.
Dr. William Burns.
Thank you. Carrying forth on this issue of hope, I think when the parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change entered the negotiations at the Copenhagen meeting, the 15th Conference of the Party, there was a lot of hope that the parties would be able to engage in negotiations which would result in long-term commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to a point where we would not exceed critical thresholds of 2 degrees Celsius. Unfortunately, those hopes were quickly dashed at those negotiations. And as a consequence, all that emerged from those negotiations and the follow-up negotiations at Cancun was a non-binding agreement which puts the world community on track currently to increase their temperature somewhere between 2.5 degrees Celsius and 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, with further temperature increases thereafter. As a consequence of this, there's been increasing interest in the use of something that we broadly call climate change geoengineering, which is broadly defined as the deliberate, large-scale manipulation of the planetary environment to counteract anthropogenic climate change. This concept of geoengineering at one point in history was viewed as akin to the crazy uncle who comes to your Thanksgiving dinner and you simply don't talk to. Unfortunately, as a consequence of the sheer desperation that the world community now sees in terms of the potential catastrophic implications of temperature increases of 2.5 to 4 degrees Celsius, we're increasingly focusing on climate change geoengineering as a potential fix to either ensure that we don't pass critical thresholds, or in the case of a so-called climate emergency. There's broadly 2 categories of climate geoengineering. The first is solar radiation management. These are efforts to divert incoming solar radiation back to space and as a consequence exert a cooling impact. Some of these kinds of technologies include the dispersion of massive amounts of sulfur dioxide aerosols into the atmosphere to deflect incoming radiation, the brightening of clouds seeding their nuclei to increase their albedo or surface reflectivity, again reflecting sunlight back out into space, or the most exotic of the SRM approaches, which is erecting a giant array of space mirrors to reflect radiation back out into space. The other broad category of climate geoengineering is the so-called CDR, or carbon dioxide removal techniques. And these include things such as dumping iron filings into the ocean to stimulate algae production, which would take more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and reduce the forcing effects associated with that greenhouse gas. Another approach is so-called air capture, in which we would use sorbents to essentially suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and again reduce the forcing approaches. Of these 2 approaches, the one that seems to have the inside track is solar radiation management, because it's extremely cheap and fairly easy to implement. Of all of these, the one that has the most inside track, in my opinion, is sulfur dioxide aerosol dispersants. The reason, again, is that it's very cheap to do, and second of all, we have some empirical evidence that it might work. And this was Mount Pinatubo. The eruption of Mount Pinatubo and the massive release of aerosols akin to what we would be utilizing exerted a substantial cooling effect, and as a consequence, proponents of this approach argue that if we were to do this regularly every 1 to 2 years, we could have a commensurate impact. For the most part to date, most of the concerns about solar radiation management, and especially this approach of sulfur dioxide dispersants, have focused on intragenerational considerations. For example, several studies have indicated that a stratospheric sulfur injection could result in substantial reductions in atmospheric evaporation, which could weaken Asian and African monsoons and could threaten the food supply of billions of people. Let's see, where's my page down? Because that's not working. In this case. However, in this presentation, what I would like to argue is that solar radiation management approaches, especially sulfur dioxide approaches, would have the potential to substantially undermine the interests of future generations, and as a consequence would violate a well-recognized international law principle of intergenerational equity. And in developing this argument, I'd like to very briefly look at three things. First of all, potential intergenerational threats that are posed by SRM geoengineering. Second of all, the implications for the principle of intergenerational equity. And third of all, the counter-argument that geoengineering actually comports and supports the principle of intergenerational equity. Some of the most serious implications of SRM schemes may be the threat that such schemes will pose for future generations. The gravest threat that these technologies could pose is the so-called termination or rebound effect. The termination effect refers to the potential for a huge multi-decadal pulse of warming should the use of an SRM technology be ceased, either as a consequence of technological failure or because of the conscious decision of future policymakers. This would be the consequence of the buildup of carbon dioxide that had occurred in the interim when that technology was deployed, and the fact that carbon dioxide feedback mechanisms would have been placed in abeyance during this time. Recent studies indicate that there would be a massive rebound effect should an SRM technology such as aerosols dispersants abruptly be terminated. The current rate of warming could increase by up to 20 times from a business-as-usual scenario, according to several recent studies. As a consequence, temperatures after the termination of such an approach could rise an astounding 7 degrees Celsius in the tropics in the course of 30 years. We could also see temperature increases of up to 6 to 10 degrees Celsius in the winter in the Arctic region within 30 years of the termination of SRM technologies. Northern land masses would also see increases of at least 6 degrees Celsius in the summer. To put this further in perspective, projected temperature increases after termination of the use of one of these technologies would occur more rapidly than the most extreme and abrupt global warming event in history, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. It is beyond contention that climatic changes of this magnitude would trigger unimaginable ecological effects. A recent study concluded that a warming rate of greater than 0.1 degrees Celsius per decade would threaten most major ecosystems and decrease their ability to adapt. Should temperatures increase at a rate of 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade, only 30% of all impacted ecosystems would be able to adapt. Yet the termination effect threatens potential decadal temperature increases of up to 13 times this rate. Beyond the termination effect, there would also be serious implications for recovery of the Earth's ozone layer. Because sulfur dioxide would create a fertile strata for the kind of chemical reactions that deplete the ozone layer, it would threaten the ozone layer substantially. A recent study indicated that geoengineering schemes that would enhance aerosol loads in the atmosphere would result in global annual mean decreases of the ozone column by more than 4.5% annually, which is more than the annual global mean decreases associated with ozone-depleting substances in the course of the 20th century. Of course, the termination effect could be averted if countries were to simultaneously engage in substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. However, there's substantial reason to believe that this would not happen because of a concept that we call the moral hazard, meaning that society would have very little incentive to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions if there was a quick and cheap technological fix. And this is true for several reasons. First of all, several studies have indicated that SRM options would cost as little as 1% or less than the cost of dramatically reducing emissions, creating a powerful political pull in favor of this technology in lieu of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Second of all, because geoengineering options would leave powerful actors and their interests relatively intact, they are likely to be backed by influential constituencies going forward. Finally, there would be substantial public support for geoengineering options because it would not undercut and would not create a need to create fundamental changes in lifestyle. I would argue that the threats posed by the termination effect and delayed recovery of the ozone layer would constitute a violation of the international principle of intergenerational equity. Intergenerational equity is a principle of distributive justice. It calls for fairness in the allocation of resources between human generations past, current, and future. Various rationale exists for the principle of intergenerational equity, including the social contract perspective that all generations are in a social contract to create an environment that is propitious for all, and the public trust doctrine, which argues that this generation is protecting the interests of future generations, as has been true in the past. As developed by Professor Edith Brown Weiss, there are three fundamental tenets associated with intergenerational equity and three primary obligations. Conservation of options, requiring that we conserve the diversity of the current base and provide options for future generations to solve their problems and realize their values. Second of all, conservation of quality, meaning that each generation has to maintain the quality of the planet in a commensurate manner for future generations, and conservation of access, providing equitable rights of access of the legacy of past generations to future generations. I would argue that intergenerational equity is a binding principle of international law. For example, it is incorporated, most importantly, in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which obviously is the most important document from the standpoint of climate policy making, specifically in Article 3.1, talking about protecting the climate not only for this generation, for future generations. Second of all, it's been incorporated and could be recognized as a principle of customary international law because of its widespread incorporation in almost universally subscribed treaties, including the CBD and CITES, the CMS, European Habitats Convention. It's also been adopted by domestic courts and in domestic legislation. Very quickly, I would argue that, SRM technologies would violate principles of intergenerational equity in several ways. First of all, a future generation would face grave implications from the termination effect. This would contravene the second obligation of intergenerational equity, outlined by Weiss, conservation of quality, because the failure of our generation to substantially reduce its emissions would result in a greatly degraded planetary conditions for future generations should such a scenario of termination of those technologies exist. Second of all, I would argue that it would violate the principle of conservation of options because a future generation would be placed on the horns of a moral dilemma. Should SRM technologies, for example, shut down monsoons in Asia and Africa and create massive drought, a future generation might wish to stop the use of those technologies. However, given the massive environmental implications of doing so, it would find itself unable to do it, which would deny it critical options and violate this principle of intergenerational equity. Finally, what I would argue is that proponents of geoengineering sometimes argue that given the potential implications of climate change, geoengineering actually comports with the principles of intergenerational equity by protecting their interests. I argue that that is a false dichotomy. It essentially, the premise is that our two alternatives are to use geoengineering or simply proceed with business as usual and condemn the world to the future associated with current greenhouse gas emissions. The third alternative, of course, is to meaningfully reduce our emissions. There's ample studies that currently indicate that we can do so, that we can create a path to stability of 450 parts per million by the end of this century in a cost-beneficial manner. If we don't do this, then what we're doing in the context of hope is simply saying that we're going to hope that a technology of this sort can get us out of another technological mess that we've created, even if it should have dire implications for both the current generation and future generations. That cannot be a premise of hope that I would argue that this generation or a future generation can pursue. Thank you.
Elizabeth Burleson. So what does hope look like? We lie between our Bali roadmap from '07, where we committed to a shared international vision of mitigating, bringing down greenhouse gas numbers substantially. Originally, within the UNFCCC context, that meant 20 to 40% below 1990 levels. What we didn't and have yet to fully commit to is the by when. By when? We started that process with Kyoto. We had a first implementation process, kicked in thanks to Russia around about '05, and it by design ends in 2012. So these international negotiations, both in the Kyoto track and in the UNFCCC track, the original Framework Convention on Climate Change track, the key difference between the two being the US is in the room, the US is not in the room. In the Kyoto context, the US unsigned. We are still trying to struggle to come up with a shared vision for a post-2012 approach, not only to mitigate, but now also to adapt to the inevitable amounts of climate change that we are going to see, irrespective of what we manage to do, to finance, and to meaningfully transfer environmentally sound technology. That was the Bali roadmap. An additional category that eclipsed the original Bali roadmap is RED. So in the forestry context, using carbon sink concept, you have an additional track of negotiations happening within these negotiations. Really is a 6 or 7 ring circus going on each year at the what's now going to be the 7th COP, the 7th Conference of the Parties, and the corollary MOP, meeting of the parties for the Kyoto context, that's going to take place this December in Durban. So, going to Durban, those of us who have slugged this out and keep on attending these things, what do we hope to see? What came out of Cancun last year that to me is a phoenix rising from the ashes. There were limited expectations, limited, albeit positive, outcomes from Cancun. We got back on track in an inclusive manner that we built trust. And we also committed to a technology mechanism. So what does this technology mechanism look like? It's going to involve a technology executive committee and a technology network. And we're still fighting out in terms of international institutional law and international, treaty law, what are going to be the respective roles of these two entities, what's going to be the funding available to each of these entities, both in relation to adaptation and in relation to mitigation. And it's looking right now like we're going to see all the same struggles that we've seen in every other aspect of not only the climate proceedings, but many other international debates as to who gets to decide. So in terms of creating a technology executive committee, is it going to be an Annex 1 country chair or an Annex 2 country chair? The difference being Annex 1 primarily the developed countries, Annex 2 primarily the developing countries. You have emerging BRIC countries that are the large emitting developing countries, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, who are in many ways the glue to these negotiations as they proceed. You also have, in the international economic context, longstanding existing treaty language in Article 20 of the GATT agreement. So in the WTO context, you have language that clearly states in a legally binding way that we are going to share environmentally sound technology. We are going to transfer this environmentally sound technology to least developed countries. So in the context of least developed countries, there's already long-standing international commitment to make this happen. It needs to be a lot broader than least developed countries. What can it look like? It can look like something as simple as solar cookers, something as simple as rainwater harvesting, capacity and know-how. In its most complex version, it can look like what's coming out of places like the MIT Media Lab and concentrated solar, and you start running into intellectual property issues. And in these negotiations, you are getting some high-powered IP folks trying to keep all intellectual property language out so that we don't achieve anything that looks like what we did in the context of AIDS medication in Africa. There are other people who clearly would like to see something similar to what we did in terms of making available AIDS medication, pharmaceutical liberalization of intellectual property rights. It's a different ball of wax altogether because for each technology, the intellectual property rights are very distinct. So it's not a one-size-fits-all context. When you look at something like advanced biofuels, it's an enzyme that right now there's a race on to try and get an enzyme that is going to want to break down cell walls. You know, most animals want sugars. They don't want cell walls. It's not considered food for most living entities. And yet, if you really want to do cellulosic ethanol or some of the more advanced biofuels, this enzyme is going to be pretty lucrative patent. Similarly, an algae strand that is both fast-growing and high energy is going to be a pretty important thing to have identified and isolated and maximized. So clearly there are intellectual property rights at stake, and some very, very important ones. In other areas, the patents have already been put on the table, and either altruistically, entities like IBM and GE are putting climate-friendly patents, making them available, and some of the funding that internationally is being leveraged, both in the private and public sector, that is going towards trying to address climate change, can certainly go towards licensing patents. So there are different directions one can go in terms of sometimes you're going to get a more advanced multiple iterations of a given development. The personal computers are a good example there. That if you make it open for further advancement, then you will start to see things get better. Locking in a certain, here's what you get, it looks like this, don't change it, isn't necessarily going to make things even better in the future. So how you work out those intellectual property issues has huge implications. In the context of best practices, we talk a lot in environmental law about you can flat out regulate, that shalt not put arsenic in the drinking water. You can incentivize or de-incentivize in terms of we're going to put a tax on gasoline, people will hopefully drive less. We're going to put a subsidy on solar panels, perhaps they will be used to a greater degree. And we've talked a lot about markets, and there's a lot of confusion about whether or not the shared vision should go in the direction of something that looks like sulfur dioxide tradable permit, fisheries tradable permits. We now have some models, the European carbon markets, the Northeast RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, some efforts elsewhere that are starting to grow and could be linked. And then we have a lot of reservations as to whether or not that is equitable, efficient, but is it equitable? Are the initial allocations adequately free of the political process? And so the questions remain. But in the technology transfer context, we have large agreement, broad spread agreement. And what was devastating to me in Cancun was the degree to which we were holding back this broad agreement as a bargaining chip. we are not going to proceed with addressing black carbon, just plain old soot, at the international level by making a wide array of solar cookers broadly available, because we want commitments on measurable, reportable, and verifiable commitments coming from countries like China. And if we can't get those, then we're not going to cooperate on this technology transfer, which we albeit all agree on, not in its entirety, not with every single intellectual property right ramification, but we broadly agree on this makes great good sense. This is low-lying fruit. So I'd like to break that and say that a shared vision, to me, means move forward on what you can agree on, and then struggle with the next step and try and build consensus and agree on something further. So it's starting to happen. And that, to me, was the value of what was accomplished at Copenhagen and the momentum with which we have to move into Durban. So in Durban, not necessarily an outcome document that's going to be a full-fledged binding legal instrument on the scale of a Kyoto Protocol. It could happen, but it's not looking likely at present. One thing that's definitely going to be likely and plausible is to flesh out further how to create a network and how to have it funded in a manner that doesn't just post to a website links to blueprints, to things that communities in developing countries don't have the capacity to carry out. So this capacity building should be the very next phrase that comes out of anyone's mouth after they say technology transfer. And in the context of technology transfer, as Will was very eloquent, that a discussion needs to be had, has yet to fully be had, on what is environmentally sound technology transfer. And as domestically, we're seeing this enormous debate play out on hydraulic fracturing. And it is being used in part as a bridging notion. And scientists are saying, oh, wait a second, it's not. So we have yet to really get the regulation out ahead of the technology, either in this country or elsewhere, on a huge range of technologies. But one way to do that is through this effort in the UNFCCC context of coming together and sharing best practices. And so I argue that universities are well positioned to play a very large role in that process. Both the legal law schools across the country that have programs that are well linked in with other both private sector and public sector, government, industry, academia, and innovators at all levels, individuals. Civil society, in part, gathers in events like these. So what does hope look like? It looks, in part, like taking innovation seriously, gathering the diaspora of skillful experts that can help make bring into being the technologies that can get us down to 350 parts per million, so that we can move beyond the political deadlock and actually achieve something hopeful. Thank you.
Is there a mouse to put it in the, oh, okay, sorry. No, I'm just not adequately competent. All right, there we go. There you go. So I want to start out by just saying a huge thank you to Michael Scharf, Nancy Pratt-Cantor, Alice Simon, Jared Gregory, Kara McLean, the other journal students, and to Betsy Burleson, who pulled this particular panel together. So I'm rounding us out by pulling together, in many ways, the two different crises you've been hearing about on this panel. So one crisis that you've been hearing about on this panel is a crisis of climate change itself. And the bottom line of the crisis goes like this. We are not doing what the scientists say we need to do to avert crisis. This is a problem. You know, I'm just finishing up my casebook on climate change. I was originally going to give 3 scenarios, one in which we adequately mitigate, one in which there's major climate change, one that might interact with the other 2 in which we turn to geoengineering. I decided to get rid of the first scenario and to just put it into, you know, choosing our future. Because the entire book was essentially about how we're not mitigating adequately. It's that bad. And so we have a sort of substantive crisis about climate change, about the lack of political will to do what we need to do to get a handle on this thing. But interrelated with the climate change crisis is the crisis that is the theme of this conference, and that is a crisis of international law. And the question is, what can we learn from this substantive crisis going on with climate change for how we might think about, conceptualize, model international law? And so that's really what I'm going to focus on in my presentation today. And somehow in my probably remaining 11 minutes, I'm going to run through 5 things. I want to talk a little bit about governance complexity and climate change. I want to talk about the aspects of how the international regime is in crisis with respect to governance questions. Third, I want to talk about why geography matters for how we might address this crisis. Fourth, I want to look at how more pluralist and new governance models, this sort of push against traditional Westphalia that we've been talking back and forth about in this conference so far, might help us see a way forward. And finally, I want to conclude by thinking about its broader implications. So here's the difficulty when you start to think about governance and climate change. So there are lots of levels of law, and there are many governmental and non-governmental actors involved. I often, in some of my prior work, have talked about there being 5 dimensions that we might think about. So the first 2 are spatial. There's a vertical dimension to climate change governance. So we're focused at this conference on the international. But the reality is that at every level of governance, from individual to local to state to national to international, there are entities that have to engage both the mitigation and the adaptation side of climate change. There's also horizontal governance difficulties because there are a lot of different actors at each level that have to deal with this problem because it's substantively cross-cutting. It's not just environmental. And then because of those sort of spatial dimensions, you get cross-cutting questions. Questions about what the direction of hierarchy is, right? Who gets to decide? Who's the decider among, or what's your decision-making structure among these various actors? Are you going to cooperate or have a conflictual model of how you get at this thing? And finally, how do you navigate the complexities of the public-private divide in all of this? And those things going on in those 5 dimensions lead to 4 aspects of the complexity of governance of climate change. The first is that there is a tremendous confluence here of scientific and legal uncertainty. And by the way, we're incredibly poor at talking in a nuanced way about climate change, right? So there's a lot of certainty about the large-scale model of climate change. A lot less certainty when you start to scale down in terms of both space and time to the here and now that we care about. But that varies across issues. We have a lot of certainty about sea level rise, less certainty about severe storms and whether a particular storm is caused by climate change. We can't get at that level of nuance in our dialogue right now and how to deal with uncertainty and what precaution in the face of that uncertainty means. There is tremendous legal overlap and fragmentation. Don't be fooled by this seeming monolithic UNFCCC regime. There's a bunch of different types of international law that applies. There's also a bunch of different types of other kinds of law that are intersecting with all of this. And so we've got to deal with the fact that simultaneously these regimes overlap and are fragmented. Huge questions about balancing efficiency and inclusion. If you decide to make the regime more inclusive as part of the response to the crisis, how do you keep it in any way efficient? And we're not efficient right now. And finally, as Deepa was talking a lot about, these deep questions of inequality and resulting injustice, and this sort of fundamental problem that the major emitters and those who are most likely to face the most severe impacts first, they just don't line up, and it's mostly poor countries of the world that have the least capacity to adapt, that are looking the worst sort of impacts, and populations within countries as well that are looking the worst impacts on the face. So If we want to turn, though, to the international regime, I think there are two aspects to the crisis that we need to focus on. So one aspect of the crisis is the clear insufficiency right now of the UNFCCC structure to solve this, right? Our framework protocol model is failing us. The bottom line is we can get broad agreement to very little, right? Or we can get a few countries to agree to a lot, but none of that is getting us anywhere near the scientists say or what's needed. And as Betsy mentioned, we don't have even agreement on whether we're going to take a one-track or a two-track model following 2012 in all of this. And just to give you some perspective on these numbers, this 350, 450 you've been hearing, so originally there were organizations formed around the idea that we needed to keep carbon dioxide concentration levels below 350 parts per million for greatest safety. Part of why we're now talking about 450 is as of this summer, we were at 393. Okay, that we're way beyond already where scientists really would like us to be if we're going to get this under control. And we show no signs of taking the dramatic action that would be necessary to get us there. So huge problems of insufficiency. But another problem is a problem of incompleteness. So as our national leaders were at Copenhagen, struggling to even agree to take note of the Copenhagen Accord, which doesn't do a great deal, there were a bunch of cities and states and provinces that were meeting in a way totally not recognized by the formal process and reaching agreements that arguably were doing a lot more than what the nation states were coming to. We don't have any way right now of integrating those different models. Similarly, when we talk about the technology transfer area that Betsy focused on, we do needs assessment on a nation-state basis, not taking into account the various ways in which subnational entities across borders might have linkages. And that leads me to talk a little bit about what our models for international law are and might be. So the reason that I think geography matters in this story is because our model for international law is intimately intertwined with how we view the nation-state's geography. So in our traditional Westphalian, certainly the strict Westphalian model of international law, we see the nation-state as an enclosed space. And we treat it as this monolithic thing, and we treat all that other stuff in how it interacts with the nation-state. And we treat all of the subnational stuff primarily as relevant to the nation-state story. And in that case, we would want to formulate our strategy for climate change in the way that we have around this big international regime, and we just have to figure out how to make it work better. Under a more modified Westphalian conception, right, if we start to say, wait a second, okay, this story isn't really complete because this nation state is actually permeable. There are all these interactions that are happening. We know there are these transnational, subnational coalitions. Okay, we'll acknowledge all of that, and we'll acknowledge that there are actors other than the nation state that are relevant in all this story, and we start to get to things like transnational legal process, which is, I think a classic example of a modified Westphalian theory. The center of the story is still the nation state, but when we try to tell the story of climate change, we're going to tell a more nuanced picture of how that all ends up happening. Now, we might go a step further and say that it's all enmeshed, and say that, in fact, the nation state and every level of government is not simply about the core entities at that level of government, but is constantly constituting and being constituted by interactions across levels of government and with a whole lot of different entities, and that all of those interactions are actually enmeshed. And if we think that, we might move more towards a pluralist conception of international law, or something more like the New Haven School, right, where we think about law as authoritative decision-making grounded in effective power, and then we begin to tell an international lawmaking story that decenters the UNFCCC as at the center of our tale, but start to talk about how we want to deal with all of these other interactions, and whether we want a governance model that includes all of those things in the governance model, in our international lawmaking model. And that leads me to this sort of question of the possibilities for pluralist and new governance approaches here, a place where I think the greatest hope resides, even though I'm not very hopeful. Right? Which is, if you think about our traditional Westphalian model over here on the right, where we organize things, you can decide whether you think it's about geographic scale, the internationals on top, or whether you think it's about power, and so you might put the nation state on top, right? We've been talking about power since our very first talk of the morning. Or on the right-hand side, we have what's more of a pluralist new governance model. I know my images are a little bit crude, right? You could make it more sophisticated than that. But where we see all of these things as more intertwined. Well, what does that look like in practical terms? Well, let's talk about cities and states and the UNFCCC. One way in which you could do it is you could actually formally change it. You could have the nation states recognize these subnational, transnational agreements as having international weight in some way. That would be hard to accomplish. It's hard to see the nation states agreeing to all of that, right? So another way of going about this would be to say, well, okay, we know that we're not going to formally get that, but somehow we're going to have a conversation about climate change in which we say, okay, so there's this going on at the UNFCCC, and there's this going on in these other agreements, and there's this going on at the subnational level, and what's our overall strategy? Right? And so there's a way in which, without changing what we're doing formally, we could be talking more informally about what our strategies are. In both of these scenarios, we have all sorts of hard implementation questions. And I'm so close to the end of my time that I'm not going to be able to get into all of the hard implementation questions, though you can certainly interrogate me about them in the question period. Right? But there are all sorts of questions about what in meaningful ways it would mean to construct this messy, huge governance model. And will that actually get us any farther? And will that get us to the political will we need? And the only thing I'll say to that is, well, possibly. And the reason that there's a possibly is if you think about Betsy's version, which says, well, let's get to what we can agree on and build from there. Well, if cities and other subnational actors that are representing about 80% of global emissions can reach agreement better than nation states can, maybe in part because they're not bound in the same way. But if you can start to get those kinds of agreements among major emitting urban areas, maybe that's a building block we need to think about, rather than simply focusing on our traditional model of we're going to do a top-down treaty. And so moving forward, the place that I'll leave you is that I think that there's real value as we face this crisis in climate change and this crisis in international law and try to envision anything hopeful about it, in this creative adventure of thinking. And in particular, I mean, there are a lot of ways we can bring in different disciplines. But the reason that I think international law at this moment needs the discipline of geography is because geography helps us deconstruct and think about the assumptions and the spaces of international law and begin to help us think about how we can reconstruct our models and deal with multiscalar governance more effectively. And this is something that's important not just to climate change, but to many other topics of this conference. I'm actually trying to bring them all together in a book where I'm comparing climate change, terrorism, and the financial crisis. A modest endeavor, I'm sure I'll do well. So the place I want to leave us with is that we are in crisis. We're in crisis about this problem. We're in crisis about international law. But my hope is that we can think creatively enough and encourage the next generation, our students, to think creatively enough that we can begin to conceptually blockbust our way out of this before the crisis gets worse. Thank you.
So has that generated any thoughts from you all on what hope looks like in the climate context?
Does the scientific community find it astounding that the United States has, in effect, the potential for electing a president who doesn't believe in climate change? That if you listen to talk radio, this has become a partisan issue when the survival of the planet seems to be at stake.
Well, you know, I was working with Amnesty International and doing tribal work and wrote myself right into a job teaching out in the Dakotas in tribal land doing water energy issues. And I think I was about the only one teaching climate at the higher education level at that point, certainly in the law context. And the legislature, you know, passed a resolution that looked very similar to the language of evolution, and pretty much said, if you're going to teach anything to do with climate, you have to spend equal amounts of time saying the opposite. So yes, I'm really very familiar with this struggle, and it has looked in large swaths of the country, like, let's not talk about climate, let's talk about energy. And you can have many of these same conversations in the energy context. It's much harder to get to the adaptation from a purely energy angle. So there are huge swaths of the conversation that are just getting thrown out. The baby is getting thrown out with the bathwater if you're going to look at solely an energy context. And yet in the mitigation arena, that is a valuable approach when you're politically constrained.
So the thing that gives me hope on the science question is an experience I had just before I left rural Virginia. One of the things that was great about teaching climate change in rural Virginia was I had a much greater measure of climate skeptics to interact with than in anywhere else I've lived or taught. And I had this guy who was helping me fix my porch steps just before I left, who heard I worked on climate change and got that look that I knew meant, okay, she's just going to say some really, alarmist thing to me now. And here's what I did instead. I acknowledged uncertainty in the science. I talked about where there's certainty and where there's uncertainty. We had a nuanced conversation. And by the time we were done talking, it was a longish conversation. By the time we were done talking, he seemed open to the idea of precaution. And so I actually think that part of our problem comes from both sides of this. On the one hand, we have ardent climate skeptics who are saying not very nuanced things. But on the other hand, we have a lot of really alarmist people about climate change who won't engage where the uncertainties are in the science in their public discourse. And I think if we can create a more nuanced public conversation, that is our best hope of getting a better public understanding of this problem.
Thanks so much. It's been terrific. I really appreciate it. I actually teach all the green politics courses at Baldwin-Wallace College, including the politics of climate change. And I have a question particularly for Professor Burns as well as Professor Badrinarayana. I'm wondering about the issue of the intergenerational equity as a legal principle. What happens if we get an international treaty where the most powerful states agree based on our intergenerational equity principle that we cannot engage in SRM, we cannot engage in these geoengineering schemes because they're too dangerous, right? But then we get a state, maybe not an LDC, the least developed country, but we get a state in the middle that can afford the price tag of actually doing something about it. And they do, in fact, take the SRM approach, some approach that's very scary, right? And they begin to undertake this. Would we consider that an act of war? Would there be some kind of a legal basis for dealing with that rogue state? Or what would we do in that context, assuming it's not China or India or some other nuclear power that we really wouldn't be able to, do something about?
I'm on the record for saying there should be a subsidiary organ of the Security Council in the manner that we've addressed terrorism, but a freestanding subsidiary organ of the Security Council precisely to look at geoengineering.
Thank you.
Well, one thing that's frightening is that it would not require a middle-level state to deploy these things. Bill Gates could afford to do this. In fact, he's investing in it right now. So is Richard Branson, right? It could be an individual that decides to deploy this. Bangladesh is looking at this currently, and they could afford to do it. You're talking about, in the case of sulfur injection, maybe $100 million a year, right? So it's a very real fear that there could possibly be unilateral deployment. I don't believe that a really small state, given all the pressures that it would face, even from a purely economic perspective and other political perspectives, would proceed unilaterally, given those pressures. I think the real fear is more likely to be a country such as China. And as you point out, in that case, that kind of unilateral deployment there's probably nothing we're going to be able to do from a military perspective or a legal perspective. What I think we need to do, and the reason that I'm talking about these kind of issues, is try to develop, even though I know it's a dirty word for some people, the norms to ensure that it's stigmatized to the point that it doesn't become part of the mainstream dialogue, and we don't start developing this very real fear I have of a moral hazard, that this is a technological fix that ensures that we don't have to in earnest look at the alternatives. And I think talking about the legal issues and the moral implications of geoengineering gives us our best hope of avoiding this kind of unilateral deployment in the future. It's a frail reed to lean on, but quite frankly, most of the reeds we have are either frail or non-existent in this context.
If I may jump in, I think that's a very interesting comment, because when I first read the title of the symposium, I read the subtopic. It said War Crimes Research Symposium. So your question kind of brings back that subtopic, and I've been thinking maybe the best way to frame this is as economic warfare. Might be a little too overdone, but I think that's what it is at the end of the day, and which brings us back to the bigger point, which is if you look at the entire structure of international law, it's geared towards power, but that power comes also from economic prowess. And so even if you talk about retaliation, such retaliation would be dependent on the economics and the dynamics of economic power. So even if you talk about intervention, I'm afraid it might depend on who is powerful enough to intervene at that point. It's very depressing, I know, but I think that's probably the direction in which I would go with that question. And if I may, I'm in a slow mode today on California time, but I thought you had a very interesting point in the back with the earlier question on science and what's happening right now with the elections. I just thought it's definitely interesting, but I'm not sure it will make much of a difference to the overall climate debate, because if you look at it will make a difference to the climate debate, pardon me, but I don't know what it will do to climate action, because if we do see what's happening right now, much is not coming from the federal government at the international level. Much of what's happening is happening locally. And today I read that Ohio, which had adopted a measure to reduce or to get 25% of its energy by 2025 through renewable sources, is going to back off, or is planning to back off, because there was a Spanish study or a University of Spain study that found that you create only, I think you create only 9 jobs and you lose much more jobs when you create a green economy or green technology. That was the link. I said, there's the international study, and here's the local action that's taking place, but it's not coming from the federal government. So I guess the good news is, even if the next president does not believe in climate change, it may not change what's happening right now. The bad news is it's further downhill probably.
And I just wanted to make a quick broader point for those of you who might not have heard about climate change geoengineering before this morning, which is one of the things that makes governance around, so the science is moving super fast in this area. There are a lot of high-level forums. The IPCC is for the first time going to include geoengineering in its assessment report in all 3 areas. So this is a major thing on the science front. There is the most infant efforts to deal with the governance issues, and there are multiple international treaty regimes that likely already apply depending on which technology you're talking about. And so Will, he has a book he's doing on this, an edited book on some of these issues. Lynn and I have an article we'll probably submit in February where we're trying to think about how you might create some harmonization in this area. But the governance is way behind the science, which is a very scary situation.
I think we have time for one more quick question.
Yeah, I have a quick question. This may be dumb, but I'm almost always the dumbest guy in the room. What is this geoengineering in reality? I mean, what are we talking about here?
We're talking about technologies that either can reduce the amount of incoming solar radiation by trying to reflect it back out into space.
I understood the scientific explanation, but what's a machine look like? What are you talking about?
Well, in the case of sulfur injection, you're taking things like airplanes or munitions and launching these aerosols and dispersing them into the stratosphere, in which they'll remain theoretically stable for approximately 1 to 2 years, and then you'd have to replenish them. Cloud brightening, you'd be utilizing remote-controlled vessels that would be injecting water particles into the clouds to increase nucleation so that it would brighten the clouds and reflect more of the radiation out. Space mirrors, that's exactly it. We'd be launching huge satellites and putting mirrors on them to reflect it. Ocean iron fertilization, we'd be taking boats out there and we'd be dumping iron in selected areas that are iron deficient, in theory, to induce production of algae. Air capture, you're using certain sorbent techniques and strata to capture the carbon dioxide. You then have to pipe it into either underground terrestrial storage facilities or into ocean terrestrial facilities, as we do in some carbon capture and sequestration
So just
contexts.
on that last point, there's a raging debate in the climate negotiations about this sequestering of carbon and whether or not one can, like calling a standing forest a carbon sink. That there's camps that are pitted against each other, arguing for including forestry in a market for, say, carbon or greenhouse gases more generally. And then there's another whole faction that wants credits, appreciation money to flow towards those that are sequestering carbon. And then the geoengineering context comes on top of that debate. So these are whirling dervishes that are often speaking past each other because the basic understanding isn't even there. You know, it takes a fair bit to understand the both legal and other implications of climate engineering, and likewise the forestry context is not entirely simple. So you know, we don't have a basic understanding even of what people are proposing.
Basically, this is like laboratory science.
It is at this point, though. There's also been some small-scale field research done by the Russians and the British. Of all of these technologies, the one that could probably most quickly be deployed is the sulfur injection. And given the small-scale experiments we've done, it's still highly speculative. Could we make aerosol dispersants that would be stable, for example? Would they have the same physical properties as what we saw in Pinatubo?
Or would they blow over to the neighbor's state
Right.
and start a war?
That's right. And those are all issues that have to be resolved. But it's a chicken or egg sort of issue. The proponents of this argue the only way we're going to know this is if we look at these technologies. And the argument they make too is that we don't want to get in a situation where we have one of these oh crap moments in the future where we believe the Greenland ice sheet's going to melt and we're going to get a 7-meter sea level rise. And we have to quickly deploy one of these technologies out of desperation that may wreak havoc with the world. Let's have a carefully calibrated international research program that looks at it now while we have the luxury and try to develop some norms to ensure equitable deployment if it's necessary. And then, of course, the opponents argue that's the highway to hell, that once we decide that these things will work, the moral hazard argument kicks in and we stop meaningfully trying to reduce mitigation, and we create this sort of Damocles that would have to be deployed for at least 1,000 years.
You're
even
tinkering
if
with a planet that's quite
Right.
old.
Right.
So
But on this scale, this isn't your mother's tinkering. Okay, this is a much larger planetary sort of tinkering that has much larger implications than anything we've done in the future. It's not weather modification, for example. It's planetary modification.
On that note, it's worth just thinking about the fact that the geophysical year in 1957 achieved the beginnings of collaboration, and that could, through our national academies and through other endeavors, be one of the ways in which we try and reach a shared vision, because internationally we are still committed to trying to reach that shared vision. And so sensible solutions, everyone's still trying to work together towards sensible solutions. So let's leave it at that. Clearly it's hard to identify what hope looks like, but hopefully you'll bring this conversation out into all the other interactions you're having and continue that conversation with everyone else you know. What does hope look like in this context? Thank you very much.